This week on The Communicators, our guest is Aneesh Chopra, the Chief Technology Officer of the United States.
And Aneesh Chopra, Chief Technology Officer of the United States, if you would start by giving us the parameters of your job, what the goals are in this position, who you report to, etc.
Well, I serve as an assistant to the President, and what that means is I report directly to him in my capacity as Chief Technology Officer. I also hold a Senate-confirmed position, which is the Associate Director for Technology in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where I work with Dr. John Holdren, the President's Science Advisor. The job of the Assistant to the President and CTO was created by our President because he felt that too often our policy discussions, whether it be in healthcare, energy, and education, failed to capture the full potential of technology, data, and innovation. And so he challenged me to complement the traditional technology portfolios that would have been in OSTP, but to think about how those capabilities could leverage these other priorities of his, and with particular emphasis on the spirit of entrepreneurship and innovation as a means to achieve these larger policy objectives. So that's been the bulk of it. It's been to advise the President to ensure that any piece of paper that comes before him is properly vetted to see where there are opportunities to engage in interagency collaboration and happily engage on any of those things.
Well, let's start with one big technology on the front burner right now,
Yes, sir.
And that's the potential transaction of AT&T buying T-Mobile. How does that lend itself to technical innovation?
Well, it's difficult to comment on a specific merger. As you know, I'd love to go deep on the issue, but the problem is it's an issue that's in front of us from a decision-making standpoint. There are equities at the Justice Department and at the FCC, so I'm not in a position to comment specifically about the AT&T and T-Mobile merger, but I'm more than excited to talk about the possibilities for technological innovation in wireless writ large. And I'd be delighted to engage on that because the President has included that as a major thrust of our activities in the wireless initiative that he rolled out in February.
And we will get into those, but we are joined by Cecilia Kang of the Washington Post as well.
Hi.
Hi, Cecilia.
Hi. Thanks for joining us, Mr. CTO.
Thank you.
You did have an event this week, today.
Yes, we did.
On Spectrum, and this is related to some of the innovation goals that you've talked about, and also related to the merger, as Peter brought up. In that, one of the promises that AT&T has put forward is to bring out wireless connections, broadband connections wirelessly to 95% of the country. So in fact, they could themselves fulfill in many ways the goal that you've set out, you at the White House have set out, and the President on blanketing the country, 98% of the country.
Well, the difference between 95 and 98 is still over 10 million. Yes, of course, it's still 10 million Americans.
Right.
But your point is well taken. In fact, the FCC's National Broadband Plan has said that today's 3G coverage is largely in pieces and parts covering 95% of the population. It is our hope to not only see that 3G connectivity upgraded to 4G, which many of the carriers have in fact all of them have committed to doing, that we also would like to extend those capabilities to those harder to reach communities. But it's not just about the extension of coverage, although that's an important part of the President's agenda. It is also ensuring that the United States economy will benefit as we progress through the wireless innovation chain to 5G and beyond, that we've got the right innovation investments taking place today to prepare for the future.
Well, one of the things that, as part of this goal, is to really create jobs right away, as part of this innovation economy goal.
Absolutely.
One thing that the CEO of AT&T said recently in an article was that he does see duplicative jobs with the merger. So, I mean, that's basically saying straightforward that there will be some sort of overlap in jobs, and that could lead to layoffs. Is that a concern when you look at a merger like this? It's hard to even talk about spectrum policy or any of these telecom things without talking about the merger in that way.
Well, I would start, let me take a little bit of a step back. The company you referenced, AT&T, actually commented publicly. It was actually the tax acceleration provisions for the administration had rolled out, the President had rolled out last year, that actually encouraged them to front load some of their LTE investments. In fact, firms like AT&T have said we were taking advantage of these provisions so we could actually front load capital. That means more jobs in the shorter term, which is exactly what the tax policy had indicated. So beginning by saying today on the ground as our private sector is investing in the upgrades to their wireless infrastructure, they're already taking advantage of policy incentives to encourage more jobs now. But the wireless story is really far beyond just the specifics of the jobs at the carriers. I think it would be a misunderstanding for the audience to presume that jobs unleashing the power of mobile broadband are only that which is in the trenches, if you will, digging out and building out networks. Overwhelmingly, and again, the economists this morning couldn't quite put an upper bound on the number, but it has been estimated to be over $100 billion of economic value if we proceed with the president's entire wireless initiative, especially as you look into the out years, because of all the companies that are taking advantage of that wireless infrastructure to build out their own products and services. So the job story on wireless is frankly a bigger one for the impact on the economy writ large, as opposed to the microeconomic question of whether or not a given set of carriers builds out.
Well, Aneesh Chopra, given that you talked about how the carriers and the private corporations are building out already, what's the purpose of having a public governmental role in this broadband?
Oh, well, this is let me take a step back and just sort of outline the president's strategy for American innovation. It's a strategy that he unveiled for the first time in September of 2009 to articulate the government's role in this entire ecosystem, and it's relevant to the question you just posed. So the president basically believes that a foundational principle of our innovation strategy is that we invest in the building blocks of innovation. And we've identified as building blocks infrastructure investments that traditionally have been seen in the roads, railways, and runways discussion. But the president has now incorporated our digital infrastructure as part of that definition. We've also talked about human capital, the individuals that pursue degrees in science and technology, engineering, and mathematics. And we've also referenced the importance of basic research and development, that which our federal labs and our nation's leading universities have been doing at a tremendous clip, plus the private sector's investments in R&D that have been encouraged by areas like the R&E investment tax credit. So this building blocks of innovation, the president has said, is very much aligned with the role of government. The key question, of course, is how. And so one of the key principles of the wireless initiative is the how for wireless is entirely built on the private sector. So the whole initiative we've unveiled has been about incentives, encouragements, policy levers to allow the private sector to extend its capabilities to more Americans and to ensure that we're prepared to lead the world in wireless innovation in the years to come. Briefly, before I close out the story of the president's innovation strategy, in addition to our investments category, he does believe that we should create the right market conditions to support private sector entrepreneurship and innovation, market-based innovation. And so for that, we've encouraged a number of initiatives, namely around the president's Startup America program to encourage more entrepreneurs in this country. Hopefully we'll get into that discussion. But the president did say there are a few issues in our economy where we need an all-hands-on-deck approach. And he has outlined a number of those, and you've heard him talk about this most recently, unleashing a clean energy economy, driving a healthcare system that improves quality and lowers costs, ensuring that we have an educational system that delivers leapfrog or breakthroughs, if you will, to close the achievement gap and, frankly, to hit the president's goal of a higher educated population to achieve our college attainment goals that he set by the year 2020. So and I'm going to happily walk you through line by line as to the wireless initiative specifically, but our basic premise is private investment, public policy actions that will spur more of it and in a way that delivers against the objective.
So before the private sector even gets their hands on the spectrum, there's a lot of things that need to be done for this strategy or this plan to work.
Yes.
So there are a lot of different cars in the train. That's right. When feasibly, when you look forward, what's the timeline for this, for spectrum to even get in the hands of the private sector? and this is assuming that everything works, that you get broadcasters to relinquish that spectrum, that you get the legislation you need in Congress, that you get the FCC to drop the rules, that you get the repackaging. I mean, you see there are a lot of cars in this process. So
But not all are sequential. There are many that work in parallel. But
that could work in parallel, that's
yes.
right. So if I am, say, a US Cellular, a Metro PCS, a Sprint, Nextel, one of these carriers, when can I expect to see that spectrum at auction for me to get my money lined up and ready to bid?
Well, let's go through the steps that we've called for. So the president unveiled a set of principles for a wireless initiative that is anchored on a very important legislative requirement, and that is to allow for the FCC to conduct voluntary incentive auctions. It is a policy tool that we think is very much in the spirit of current policy, which is to allow the FCC to auction spectrum, but add some very important components that these 100+ economists said are mission critical to achieving the real economic benefits of wireless. And so it starts with the proposition that we need a bill from our Congress that the president will sign this year that will allow the FCC to have incentive auctions authority. There are also, we believe, critical investments to be made in combination with the incentive auction authority. We believe it is critical to invest in what we think has been a 10-year promise in the making to build out a nationwide public safety broadband network. As you all recall, in the wake of the tragedy of 9/11, we identified the fact that our communication systems are not up to speed when it comes to what's in the hands of our first responders. I was in a cop car in New York City even this past year, and the cop car had no digital communications in the actual vehicle. When I asked, when you pull over a vehicle, how do you actually run the plates? I pick up the CB and I radio in the plate numbers and I wait for the operator to respond back. In today's real-time, mobile, always-on connections in our personal lives, to think that our first responders don't have access to the, not even better, just the same tools that we have in our personal lives, the president says, that's not happening on our watch. We are going to ensure that our families in this country are safe and are secure because their first responders are equipped with the very best that's available to them. Today, it's not there. So we've allocated $10.7 billion out of the incentive auction proceeds to build out that public safety broadband network, and there are some components in there that are worth talking about. We also believe it is absolutely critical that we extend to this 98% goal. The president just sees this third wave of economic growth on the internet. You know, we had the dial-up era, we had the early broadband era, and now we get into the mobile broadband era, that this absolutely is an economic equity question that is all Americans, and we believe for technical and feasible reasons, 98% is the right target, should get access to this capability, and 10 million more Americans should have it than have it today, and then, or that have the capacity to have it today based on projections. And then third, and perhaps the one that brings me the most excitement from the perspective of my role as Chief Technology Officer, President allocated $3 billion out of the wireless proceeds, auction proceeds, for an innovation fund, specifically so we could ensure that the U.S. economy, our nation's best and brightest scientists, technologists in the universities, our federal labs, and our private sector colleagues who've been repeatedly telling us that they are increasingly shifting dollars away from basic R&D at what you would call the metal of our wireless networks up into these more high-margin services, these areas, you might call them the iPhone App Store explosion. Everybody has their version of the App Store. That this is an important part of our story, and that the president believes we've got to get the right engine of innovation flowing so that as we project out 5 years and beyond, it is the American economy that will produce the products, the services, the infrastructure that would export to the world what we think is that next wave of economic growth.
This is C-SPAN's Communicators program. Our guest this week is the U.S. Chief Technology Officer, Aneesh Chopra. Joining us is Cecilia Kang of the Washington Post. She's the technology reporter for that newspaper. Very quickly, if you would, we've referred obliquely to this meeting that happened at the White House this week. What was this meeting?
Earlier today, a group of economists from all ends of the political spectrum, if I may use the term, those that served in the Bush administration, in Clinton administration, those that are in all walks of life, if you will, in terms of their political leanings, came together and wrote a shared letter calling on Congress to promote this notion of voluntary incentive auctions to ensure that that policy lever is in place, because fundamentally our economy is a market-based economy where you have assets that trade to their highest and best use. And what these economists said, and of course I'm not trained as an economist, but what these economists basically said is that by moving towards a voluntary incentive auction authority, there will be a market mechanism that would allow whether or not the owners of spectrum today, or I should say those that are utilizers of spectrum today, would see value in contributing that spectrum to be available for those that believe there's a better, higher economic purpose to that end.
So the most vocal proponent of auctions, a company that really wanted to buy up spectrum, was T-Mobile. T-Mobile may now be sort of swallowed up into the AT&T universe. Do you think, so related to the spectrum strategy, there's a concern. Analysts, industry experts say that you're not going to have as many people bidding on the spectrum. So you may not make that $27.8 billion that you want to feed into those different components that you just laid out, the R&D, the public safety, all that stuff. So how does the consolidation of this industry affect the success or the projected success of your whole strategy?
Well, again, it's difficult to comment about a pending merger, about its implications, but let me make a first broad observation. Irrespective of the market landscape, the authority to conduct incentive auctions is a mission-critical step from a public policy standpoint. There will be circumstances in each direction along the way, some that would argue increases the value of spectrum, others that would argue potentially might decrease the value of spectrum. The beauty of having the auctions authority is nothing defines success than a mechanism whereby an owner or a utilizer of an asset expects a price and a buyer of an asset offers value. That, the gains of trade, as the economist spoke of today, is the ultimate arbiter of whether or not there's enough demand in the market. If there is insufficient revenue to meet the needs of the owners of or the utilizers of spectrum today, then the auction won't move forward. The policy remains solid. That is, that the Incentive Auctions Authority give the FCC the tools to conduct that auction. I happen to have high confidence that economic principles will hold, and that the absolute reality is spectrum is a scarce resource. We've recently come to understand just the sheer magnitude of the use in our personal lives. Just to give you some statistics that have been coming out recently, the average smartphone uses 25 times as much data as a regular voice cell phone. And our tablets that all of us are buying at record clip that have made my family's life a little bit more exciting, 100 times the usage of data. So we do not know what the ultimate the demand will be projecting out 5-10 years, but unless you have the tools to conduct that auction, you can't actually realize whatever the circumstances might be.
Do you think that there's enough competition in the wireless industry?
Thankfully, I'm not the one to render that judgment.
But should you, as the CTO of the country,
well, we have
a sense of that?
The reason I say that is it's the FCC's technical responsibility to render such judgments in a report that they issue every year, and so they have
as the Justice Department in the context of this merger.
In this context, Justice Department activities are really not at the review of the White House. These are actions that are effectively independent, as they should be. So, for purposes of evaluating a given transaction, it's really not the process, purview, or appropriate for the White House to engage. That's just the nature of the circumstance. But the bigger question is whether or not there are emerging technologies that are changing the mechanisms by which one reaps the value of wireless technology. We haven't even begun in this conversation discussing the power of shared spectrum and dynamic spectrum allocation, and the market makers that would allow those that are rights holders to spectrum to essentially allow secondary users to participate in that market, and that there's an economic transaction to be had. So it is an important question, of course, to say what are the carriers doing and what's happening in the economy. But my job for the president is to say, are we properly deploying the right R&D investments, ensuring that we've got the entrepreneurial engine focused on this? Are the policies in place so that we can ensure leadership on this issue for the years to come? And I have a lot to say on that front.
And speaking of policy, what would you say about this idea that, well, actually just ask you directly, why did you decide to give spectrum to the public safety community? In that, there are some that would say that that actually led T-Mobile to decide that they could not get spectrum they wanted to more quickly deploy 4G, because you actually didn't answer my first question on when spectrum would be available in the hands of
sorry. Yes.
But before I get to that, do you think that T-Mobile was affected by that decision in that they needed and they wanted that D-block spectrum that, and I'm getting really in the weeds here, but in that spectrum, that 10 megahertz that will be, according to your plan, allocated to public safety. And some would say that that decision effectively forced the company to decide that it didn't have many other options but to consolidate with AT&T.
Look, the good news is I'm not the chief strategy officer for T-Mobile, so it's hard to get into their brains to understand exactly what their calculus was, or AT&T's or Sprint's. I had a very specific charge by the president. Does our policy today ensure that our first responders have access to the same technologies that you and I do as individuals so that they can perform their mission objectives to the fullest extent possible? And as we evaluated, we went through a very exhaustive exercise, the private sector, our first responders, academic leaders. We held public forums, roundtables. I was personally engaged on this issue because the president asked me to do so. The vice president and his very, very strong team has been a leader on these issues for years. The National Economic Council, we've all partnered up to understand objectively what are the needs of our public safety community. Will they be met under various policy constraints? And that led us to make the decision that for this capability to get into the hands of the first responders in the technical means by which they need them, it was important for us to establish their own public safety network and to give them the best and the brightest.
Anish Chopra were the broadcasters at your Spectrum meeting at the White House.
Well, let me be careful about in today's meeting.
Yeah.
They might have been in the audience. The economists that spoke weren't representing any given broadcasters. But I would tell you, I've spoken to a number of them, and there's some very thoughtful conversations to be had, and that are all going to be built into the congressional process. And there's some questions about, look, what does voluntary mean? Will I have the ability to still broadcast my channel, but participate in this auction in some form or fashion? Will there be opportunities for me to make sure that if, in fact, I don't want to participate in this, that you're not going to force me down into the lower VHF frequencies that'll be less than ideal for me? Those are thoughtful conversations, and those are conversations that absolutely will take place as we set the rules of the road on the Hill. Today's meeting was really about understanding the economic value, not the owners of the spectrum or the holders of the spectrum. There's no reason why a judgment by a broadcaster to say, I see a vision of mobile broadcasting that is in my future that delivers economic value in excess of what I could have otherwise gotten from auction. Bless you. That's the power of a voluntary incentive auction.
Should there be an inventory of spectrum?
Well, I think, certainly there are a lot of technical questions about what's currently in use, what's not. My focus on that question is really to understand how does one engage on dynamic spectrum sharing, so that if you look at the white spaces debate, effectively one of the key questions is there a database that one can use to ensure that when you're going into unlicensed white spaces that you're not interfering? Those are technical components that you would want to have as part of a larger innovation agenda that takes full advantage of spectrum that may be in this, what the National Academies wrote a piece, and they had a wonderful line. They said, design your spectrum policy focused on lightness, not darkness. Today's policy is darkness. Clear the band. It's empty. Now the highway's yours. Go run and build economic growth. In the future, their argument in the Academy's report on wireless was, look, there's a lot of noise. You've got to start engineering wireless products and services that can manage around the noise. In a sense, that's this question of, the notion of a noun, is there a, quote, inventory, versus the verb, which is how does one understand the situational awareness in order to render judgments about property rights and the ability to communicate. I'm much more emphasizing the verb than I am any particular notion of a noun.
Okay. Let's switch gears to privacy. The White House, for the first time, said that it endorses the idea of a law a first-time law for privacy on the internet. Do you support the recommendation by the Federal Trade Commission to create a mandate for a do not track sort of technology that would stop websites from basically following users on the web based on some sort of browser technology? You support this idea of do not track?
We have not taken a formal position on do not track at this time. What the president called for, and we've had an interagency review, and this is one of the areas that I've had particular leadership and emphasis on. The Commerce Department has been phenomenal in developing a green paper that was published maybe 3 or 4 months back at this point. And that was the basis upon which Larry Strickling delivered the testimony that he did just a couple weeks back, where we expressed our formal commitment to base privacy protections, and we thought that FIPS, the Fair Information Practice Standards, should be the baseline. We also acknowledged that the FTC should have enforcement authority on that base privacy provision, and that there should be enforceable codes of conduct emphasizing the role of voluntary cooperation. Now, why do I give you this long, convoluted story? It is conceivable that the browsers, the internet economy more generally, key stakeholders on their own in a voluntary fashion come together to put together the functional equivalent of a do not track program, and that may come in as a voluntary industry-led program that then could be enforceable by the FTC as a commitment they've made to improve privacy. The reason I see the slight distinction here is that our framework stopped short of any particular mandates akin to do not track, and was much more about a framework for how privacy policy should come moving forward, and it emphasized most certainly the notion of voluntary enforceable codes of conduct.
Which is what the industry wants. They want sort of more of a self-regulatory, voluntary thing. It sounds actually quite different from what the FTC's proposing.
I don't know if it's particularly different or not. The question ultimately is to what, again, separate the noun from the verb. What is the objective? If the objective is to strengthen the privacy posture of the American people in a digital age, I think we're as explicitly clear as possible about our intentions. The policy mechanisms we've outlined thus far, and we haven't really rendered a final judgment about what the ultimate legislation should be, but as a model and a framework, we've said base privacy protections. We've said ensuring that there's this enforcement authority over the FTC to look into this, that Commerce in its capacity has a privacy office that can engage on these issues in a bit of more engaging and collaborative way, and that it's about voluntary codes of conduct as a mechanism. Now, we've had some experience outside of privacy with this notion of industry consensus standards activities, and I think very positively. On healthcare IT, in less than 1 year, we've seen the private sector step up to the plate and agree to technical standards for safe, secure email. Did you know that you today can't have your doctor email your medical record to a specialist? In the 21st century economy, you can't have your medical record emailed to yourself? Because email is inherently insecure. People are concerned about the implications for health insurance, HIPAA, the Health Insurance Privacy and Portability Act. The industry, after hearing the challenge, stepped up to the plate and in 90 days agreed to a technical amendment to how email is operating, basically authenticating you and you as the sender and the receiver, encrypting the message in between, and ensuring that it actually is transmitted using the principles of really the highest levels of security. That happened because the private sector stepped up and did it. And by the way, no regulatory framework yet. The industry, 90% of the healthcare sector has already accepted they would support the what's called the direct specification for safe, secure email. So if you focus on verbs, that is, how do we achieve an objective, and you engage in what's been the greatness of the American economy, that is, we've got incredibly entrepreneurial and innovative companies, but when you channel their energy against policy challenges, great things will happen. And I think the same spirit applies in privacy and a number of other domains.
And unfortunately, we've only scratched the surface on the issues we wanted to discuss with you, so you will have to come back soon. Aneesh Chopra, Chief Technology Officer of the U.S., and Cecilia Kang of the Washington Post. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.